What are the differences between zinc white and titanium white? That's what we're exploring today. I'm also going to talk about how I use either or. We'll also be comparing side by side 5 different brands of white gouache, and I'm going to show you how I use gouache with watercolor. That's probably enough for one video, so let's dive in. The first thing I did was swatch all of my gouache straight out of the tube, and I used a palette knife so I can get a nice thick result, although I don't recommend using a palette knife normally with gouache as it sometimes results in paint that's too thick, which can crack. Then I swatched everything with a damp brush, which is much more of a realistic situation as we're normally painting with a slightly damp brush. Next, I'm testing the tinting strength of each of these white gouaches. Using the same exact amount of gouache each time, I touch in a little bit of watercolor and do a swatch on top of the black mark. The first swatch is zinc white and all the rest are titanium white. And you can quickly see that the titanium white is much more opaque. The zinc white is a little more transparent, which means that it doesn't quite overpower the color the same way, so you can get much more vibrant mixes. However, if you're going for covering power, titanium white is a better option. In order to get a fair comparison, I tried many different colors. Some of these watercolors are more transparent, some are more opaque, and the gouache consistency of each brand changes how it looks as well. So there are a lot of factors at play here. It would be nearly impossible for me to get the exact same amount of gouache and watercolor in each mix, but I did my best, and to be honest, that's much more of a real-world approach anyway. When we sit down to paint, we are often introducing varying amounts of water. Even if we try to color match something, it won't be perfect. So I don't want anyone watching this to get caught up comparing everything with a magnifying glass. Overall, what I learned is this. Depending on the brand and the exact pigment and binder formula used, you might get slightly varying results. But overall, I felt that each of these performed admirably. I didn't feel like any one in particular was horrible, and I didn't feel like any one was amazing compared to the rest. That said, I did notice a couple very tiny differences that I'll share here. If I had to pick 3 of my favorites, it would be the Winsor & Newton, the Schmincke Horadam, and the Daniel Smith. They had amazing covering power and really nice consistency. The Shinhan and the Emgram weren't terrible by any means. It's just that they were a little bit more runny, I would say. So it felt like I needed a bit more of it to get the same mixing strength. Oddly, the Schmincke Horadam titanium white dried kind of shiny. And even in the tinted versions, you can see a bit of shine. Something I love about gouache is the matte finish. So I'm not sure if my tube has just gone bad over the years or if this is normal. Please let me know in the comments if you've ever noticed that. The Winsor & Newton also has just the tiniest amount of shine, only at certain angles, and it's not quite so bad in the colored mixes, but again, don't know what that's about. Maybe let me know if you've experienced this too. So I guess my final thoughts on all of this is to just go with a gouache that is affordable for you in your country, because that varies quite a lot depending on where you live. Before I ever even understood the differences between zinc white and titanium white, I knew that zinc white was more transparent. You can kind of tell from the first time you use it. And as a preference, I reached for titanium white more often. So over the last 5 or 6 years, the majority of my paintings have been using primary white. However, if you are someone who likes to use watercolor with gouache, you might find it more useful to use zinc white because that allows a bit more of the color to show through, but you still get the benefit of some opacity. And to demonstrate this, I'm now going to do a demo with zinc white and watercolor. In my last video, I took you to this amazing place on the coast of Scotland, a place I often go to paint. I have so many reference photos from that day, so I'm looking forward to painting it this winter. So while this video plays in the background, I'm going to share some of my tips and lessons learned with using watercolor combined with gouache over the years. I'm also going to put some tips up on the screen now and then, specifically related to what's happening at that moment in the painting. It's not necessary, but I like to start by staining my paper with a fun color. I let it dry completely before I start the painting. And sometimes this color peeks through in what I do above in the other layers, but I choose a color that represents the feeling I'm going for in case little bits of it peek through. In this case, I was going for a very soft, serene beach with some sunset colors. Now, the first thing to think about when doing this technique is what happens to our colors when we add white gouache. Adding white essentially dilutes the color as well as lightens the value. Depending on how much we add, the overall feeling can lean a little towards a pastel look. It's still possible to achieve dark and rich tones when adding white, but there's a lot of practice needed in order to know how much white to add. Adding white gouache also increases the opacity, so we don't have to stick to the traditional watercolor mindset of painting light to dark. In fact, when I do this, I think about it exactly like using gouache. I think in layers. Typically, when you dilute white gouache with water, it will darken when it dries, so it allows what is underneath to show through. And using zinc white, which is more transparent, increases that even more. So if you're combining zinc white with watercolor and adding water, this will definitely increase the drying shift. So sometimes I'll put a stroke down and I have to wait for it to completely dry to see what my result is before I move on. Or you can fill in a pretty big area, let it dry, and then go on back on top of it with more layers. So you might be wondering, why not just use gouache? Well, this technique is great for someone who's coming from a watercolor background and wants to give gouache a try without investing in a full set of gouache. It also allows you to kind of dip your toes into the gouache process as much or little as you like to see if it's something you want to invest in. It can also be a great method for travel painting. So instead of bringing your watercolor set and your gouache set or agonizing over which set to bring if you're trying to pack lightly, you can have the best of both worlds. You can bring a limited watercolor kit and one tube of gouache and have a nice compact kit to go. Technically, you could squeeze your white gouache into a watercolor palette or a half pan and let it dry, just like watercolor. However, in doing so, it will require water to reactivate, and adding even the tiniest amount of water to white will dilute it, as I said before, and you'll lose some of that opacity right away. That might be okay for what you're doing, but I prefer to use white from the tube whenever possible, so I would just throw in a tube of white into my bag. And I bought this big tube of zinc white years ago, and I'm still going through it, so it does last quite a while. Okay, let's go back to what I said earlier about how the white gouache is going to change the look of your colors. One really easy way to visualize what will happen is to do a little digital work. So let's bring our reference image into a photo editing software. You can use any of the editing tools like contrast, brightness, levels, or curves. When you drag the sliders up, it lightens the image, and see how everything looks more grayed out and less saturated? That's exactly what happens when you add white gouache. Now, of course, how much white you add will change the results, but this is kind of a quick way to visualize it. You can also play with what colors are prominent in your scene or see what happens when you use really interesting color combinations. And you can play with the color temperature. Color temperature refers to how warm or cool your colors are. Warm colors lead towards the red side of the color spectrum and cool colors lean towards the blue side. If you increase the saturation to plus 100, you can see an exaggerated version of color temperatures. The setting sun provides that nice warm light hitting the cliffs and the sand in the middle, and the shadows appear extremely like pure blue. So when you're deciding on what colors to use in your landscape, you can keep this color temperature structure in mind, and that can help you. So back to the painting. As I continue to layer my paint, I'm keeping in mind the play between warm and cool colors. I'm also remembering that the white gouache is going to lighten the value and desaturate my colors. Overall, that helps me to create a more muted, soft palette, and that's actually something I've been working towards for a while. You've probably heard me talking about it in previous videos, how I'm getting really into grays. My goal as an artist right now is to become more sensitive to the power of gray in a landscape. And without grays and muted tones, our vibrant tones won't sing. They won't appear as vivid. So you can really use this to your advantage if you can harness the power of grays. You can draw focus to areas or keep everything feeling very calm and muted. And by working with a limited palette and adding white to all of my mixes, this kind of does some of the work for me and helps me create those muted tones that I love. I am someone who is very drawn towards vibrant colors and high contrast, so a muted palette is a little bit challenging for me. But in doing studies this way, I learned so much about subtle color mixing and grays and atmospheric effects in the landscape. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this subject. Have you done this technique before? Do you love it or hate it? What's your favorite white gouache and why? I have included a link to a blog post with all of my scans, the results of the swatches I showed you earlier. And of course, if you'd like full-length painting tutorials, make sure to check out my Patreon page where I post 2 tutorials a month and lots more information. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon. Take care.